Hello friends, it's Anne from Higher Ground Welding and Art, and I was thinking I would take this morning to explain why my business is called Higher Ground. And it has everything to do with my home, which used to be down there. This is our old family home that was moved in two pieces from down where the lake is now. Reservoir, whatever. Flooding had been a big problem downstream, actually north of here, kind of in the Corning, New York area. And so they were doing a flood mitigation project. And I think it was determined back in the 1950s that a dam needed to be built to hold back the water in our neck of the woods. And it just so happened to be where my family's tobacco farm was. A lot of the areas up here in the north had tobacco. It was one of the first crops that people planted, when the white people came. A lot of people had tobacco in their backyard, like a garden. From what I've been told and understand from the old timers, the town of Nelson was charming. Not exactly bustling, but, not bad for a town that size. There was a railroad that came through. There were mills. There was a town center. They had square dances. Had a dry goods shop where they got a lot of their stuff and ran tabs. They had a shoe store with a barber shop in the back, a post office, watering holes, places to eat. It was an actual little town. It was a valley town. One of my goals is to learn more about the indigenous in this area. And from what I understand, this wasn't really where they would settle, but they were up in the Finger Lakes region of New York, and they would come down here to hunt. These were more like the summertime hunting grounds. They began construction on the dam, and when the plans came to let the water raise, residents were given the notice and evicted. The government bought up the properties for a pittance, and then you could buy your property back for slightly less. So they gave you money for your farm, and then they said, oh, do you want to buy it back? Do you want the houses? Do you want the buildings? We'll give you a deal. My family did, and a lot of others in the town took advantage of that too, and the houses got moved up above the water level. It's a cool story, but there were a whole lot of people who couldn't afford to do that. They couldn't take the money and put it back into their home and move it. Some of them were too old. Some of them just, didn't have the support system to do that. My grandmother was really active in getting things moved, in documenting everything and getting funding for the new town. She is sometimes called the matron of Nelson. My grandmother has a notebook of all the families she interviewed and what they planned to do and where they planned to go. Some went upstate into New York, some went up the valley into some of the bigger towns or went to live with family, and some just scattered. Around 40 houses got moved up onto Higher Ground, including ours. When I very first moved back to this area after being downstate PA, upstate New York, coming back to where I'm settling now, I had started building a little bit. I got my first welder and I was tinkering in a shop up here. Through a series of land exchanges with the family as the generations were moving along, I kind of had to relocate from being up here, the original place where I called my shop Higher Ground, to its current location the next town over, down in the lowlands. So what started as essentially a tin shed up on the hill in the woods is now a formal building on Main Street. That's where I do most of my videos. The business name, Higher Ground Welding and Art, goes back to a time that I was working up on the higher ground. So eminent domain, I guess, plays a crucial role in the naming of my business today. The town was moved in 1979. I'm the youngest in my family by a lot. I've got 3 older siblings. And there are these pictures of the 3 of them sitting on the split rail fence on the farm down here when they were kids. As far as I know, this house has always been here and we've always had a town up there. I only know the old Nelson from the stories that people have told and aerial photographs and some old photos. There's one gentleman that went around and documented everything during the move. Showed the houses up on the trailers, showing buildings being demolished, showing bridges being torn apart, new ones being built. And it really was a blow to the community. So while we've still got people physically living in town, we're a little more scattered. We used to be neighbors. Bands used to come play and they would have square dances. There were kids on bicycles with paper routes. That's not a thing. There was an Oddfellows Hall, all matter of other strange fraternalish organizations. Maybe I ought to start one. Traveling salesmen came through and tried to hawk their wares. There was an elementary school here. There was a one-room schoolhouse, and then there was a high school. We had a high school too. Now my kids don't even have a high school. We'll be traveling out of the area to attend high school. So there's still people who remember the old town, and they are just older than I am. So I'm 41 and I just barely remember all of this happening. Like I say, all the houses were in place by the time, I have my core memories here, but I do remember before the water filled up. I remember the original channel the river took, hugging the edge of the valley before it, filled up into a reservoir. And I think it's all due to my dad. My dad used to take us fishing down to the river probably so we remember what it was like before they built the lake. I remember the water coming up. So if you take a walk down by the Kawaneski Lake and you have the proper mental image, you can almost see the houses spring up. That biggish road I just crossed has all the traffic sounds on it. Used to be this. This is old Route 49. Here's the old guardrail. So while I'm standing at the edge of what looks like wetlands or a lake, used to be a town. And that's about the edge of where my family's property and tobacco fields were. And our town center currently resides up there, and a lot of the houses are over behind those trees. Oh, so my grandmother testified before Congress to convince the government that Nelson was worthy of funding to have a town. I don't know as if any funds were allocated to get people to move their houses, you know, not just the cost of buying their property back, but getting it moved up to where it would be safe if they wanted to stay in Nelson. But she did get funding for the post office, the fire department, the low-income housing, and there are these funny stories about Grandma coming to Nelson with Congressman Joe McDade from Scranton for photo opportunities and explanations of why things had to be done properly and not just thrown together the way the Corps does them. I have a friend over in Wellsboro who was 17 at the time of the move, and so he was using some heavy equipment, and he was actually doing the move. So he's old enough to remember that, but young enough to still remember everything. And he said that he watched Grandma walk through the cemetery with the congressman and like the general of the Army Corps. I'm probably getting that wrong. But like the project manager for this Army Corps of Engineers project. She was walking between the headstones with them, and they were starting to tip already. They had to move the cemetery. They had to move some of the graves. That would be a good story for me to tell sometime. So they had to reset some of the headstones, and she would go by one that was kind of upset, and she would say, now Mr. So-and-so, is that the way a headstone's supposed to look? And he would say, no, Mrs. Wiley, that's not the way it's supposed to look. And she'd say, Joe, is that the way a headstone is supposed to look? No, Mrs. Wiley, nope, that's not the way it should look. So my grandmother was out there supervising the work that the Army Corps of Engineers was doing. Depending on what side of the fence you're on, could be a complete pain in the butt or a saving grace. I think people around here saw her a little bit of both. This is where the asphalt starts to become overgrown. I think I'd like to do a little more explanation of the stuff that's around here in the old town of Nelson. I'll probably do that on my personal account where I focus a little more on history and personal things. So in short, my business is called Higher Ground because my family home used to be down here.